Welcome to this recorded presentation on the Federal Individual with Disabilities Act, or IDA, Part B 611 and 619, and the American Rescue Plan Act, Proportionate Set Aside for Parentally Placed Private School Children with Disabilities. This presentation will focus primarily on the financial aspects of Proportionate Set Aside, also known as PSA. The Office of Special Education Finance and Budget, often referred to as the FAB team, is responsible for assisting, monitoring, and managing the federal IDA PSA allocation that is used by public school divisions to support parentally placed private school children with disabilities. Shalonda Lewis is the financial data specialist of the FAB team that oversees the fiscal accountability of PSA. Annually, she works to ensure that school divisions have the correct PSA allocations and understands the regulations and management of the funds. If you have questions, please send them to the FAB office email at sped-finance@doe.virginia.gov with PSA in the subject line. Shalonda or someone from our office will respond as soon as possible to your questions. These resources, the recent superintendent's memo dated October 22nd, 2021 on PSA verification and the approval process, as well as the updated PSA guidance document in your last year's report, will be information helpful for you to reference as you watch this recording. This session is intended to support school division personnel in developing basic knowledge of PSA regulation and practices that include new changes to the verification and approval process, how the PSA funds are calculated, what expenditures are allowed and those that are not allowed, and tips for managing the PSA reimbursement process. The presentation is divided into 5 sections for ease of locating information. Section 1, what is proportionate set aside and what's new this year? Each year, school divisions must set aside a calculated share of their IDA Part B 611 and 619 federal allocation to provide equitable services for students with disabilities who are placed in private schools by their parents or who are being homeschooled. This includes qualified religious, elementary and secondary, and home schools located in the division's jurisdiction. In Virginia, homeschooled is synonymous with home instruction, as noted in the Administrative Code of Virginia. However, the Code of Virginia mandates certain criteria that parents must meet in order for the homeschool to qualify. For the purposes of this presentation, the term parentally placed private school children includes homeschooled students. School divisions are required to submit a count of parentally placed private school children with disabilities annually in the December 1 child count. The child count data is verified by the school division at the time of the submission. This data is being used to pre-populate the student count in the PSA report. School divisions are required to review the PSA data and verify that it is accurate before sending it to the BDOE in November. This is done through the web-based PSA calculation application that is accessed through the Single Sign-On for Web Systems, or SSWS. New for this year and going forward, all of the student counts required for this calculation are pre-populated. This is in contrast to prior years when school divisions had filled in certain data. Now the school division is required to only verify that the pre-populated data is correct. Also new this year is the addition of the pre-populated data and calculations for the ARP PSA funds. Later in this presentation, you will see these lines on the PSA worksheet. Line 8 represents the total ARP 611 and 619 allocation. This line is automatically pre-populated from the Online Management Education Grant Award System, or MEGA, as we call it. Line 9 represents the auto-generated average ARP allocation per eligible student. And line 10 represents the auto-generated amount to be expended for homeschooled or parentally placed children with disabilities. This amount represents the total amount of ARP funds that must be set aside for homeschooled or parentally placed children with disabilities. Section 2, how to access the PSA verification and submission process, the pre-populated data form and submission verification, and we'll talk about budget transfers. The 2021-22 Proportionate Set-Aside Guidance document on the Office of Special Education Grants and Budget webpage is the place to start. There is also a link to this guide in the superintendent's memo at number 298-21 dated October 22nd, 2021 on PSA submission. This guide will provide a very clear process for submitting the verified report and approval by the school division superintendent. As you can see on the slide, in order to access the PSA worksheet and report, you must first sign in to SSWS. Then click on the Special Education Proportionate Set-Aside application. A window will pop up that indicates when the submission window will close. On the right side of that page, you'll be able to click on Worksheet or Reports. The worksheet allows you to view the current data, and reports allow you to view past PSA verified submissions. This chart displays after selecting the worksheet option from the menu on the upper right side of the screen in SSWS. This is the worksheet where data is pre-populated and calculations are completed for the school division's proportionate share. This is an actual picture of the report that is submitted to BDOE. As you can see, all the items are pre-populated. Line 2 represents the number of parentally placed eligible private school children with disabilities submitted in the December 1, 2020 child count. This number should reflect the December 1, 2020 child count data verified by your division. The total dollar amounts are generated from Omega. Question: what do you do if the child count number or the amounts are not accurate at the time you view this worksheet? Please contact Karen Puckett, Director of the Office of Special Education Data, for child count concerns, and for finance concerns, contact Shalonda Lewis at the Special Education Office of Finance and Budget. Their contact information is provided at the end of this presentation. As we discussed earlier, line 8, 9, and 10 have been added to accommodate the PSA portion set aside from the ARP allocation. It is important to note that lines 7 and 10 are the total amounts that must be set aside or reserved for PSA. It is important to account for regular IDA PSA set-aside funds separate from ARP PSA funds. Do not commingle these funds, even though they are both for PSA. One is regular and one is ARP. They must be kept separate. When the user is ready to submit the worksheet, first click the Save button, then click the Submit or Verification button. If the user is not ready to submit, click the Save button and the worksheet will remain open for review. Once the worksheet is submitted, the collection window will automatically lock and the application will notify the superintendent of the division to review and approve the submission. If a revision is needed after the worksheet is submitted, but before approval, the user must notify the superintendent to disapprove the submission to unlock the collection window. If a revision is needed after the submission is already approved, the user must contact BDOE to reopen the collection window. The superintendent's approval process is a similar process used for accessing the worksheet. First, the individual must sign into SSWS, then click on Data Collection Approval. A window will show on the screen, and the superintendent must click on the report name. Another screen will display that prompts a review and approval or disapproval, and the submission button must be clicked in order for it to reach BDOE. Again, please remind your superintendent to push the submission button. Again, there are directions for this process in the PSA guidance document. This is a screenshot of a submitted approved PSA report. Don't forget that the report is not submitted to BDOE until the superintendent or the designee approves or disapproves and clicks the submit button. If the report is approved, then the submission is completed and the collection window will close. If the report is not approved, then the collection window is reopened and resubmission is required. An explanation is required for disapproved submissions. Once again, BDOE will need to be contacted to open the collection window or to discuss any concerns. Once the division has submitted the PSA data and verified it, school divisions will need to reserve PSA amounts under the object codes 000 and Omega until such time as the division is ready to use reserved PSA funds for PSA activities. Please take a moment and review this slide. This information is also in the guidance document. This action is required for both the Omega IDA regular 611 and 619 funds and for the ARP funds in Omega. If the division has already distributed funds between object codes 1000 and 8000, please contact Shalonda Lewis for assistance. Section 3. Now we reviewed the submission process for DOE. Let's see how the funds are actually formulated and review the spending timeline. The parentally placed private school children that a school division must count in their PSA calculations include all children who attend a private school and have been evaluated and found eligible for special education and related services, but are not receiving services, and those children found eligible and are receiving services through a developed services plan. Each LEA must determine the total number of private school children with disabilities who are enrolled by their parents in private elementary schools and secondary schools located in the school division, and the total number of children with disabilities enrolled in the public and private schools located in the jurisdiction of the school division. Remember, the students with disabilities attending a private school in the school division's catchment area are to be counted by this school division regardless of where the child resides. Remember that the child data is submitted in December and the child has, and the school, has verified the count. If you need information regarding the count, please contact Karen Pluckett. For example, let's look at the timeline rule for spending PSA funds. Basically, an IDA allocation is for 27 months. And if a school division does not spend all of the PSA funds in the first year of the allocation, the remaining funds for special education and related services to children with disabilities placed by their parents in private schools must be carried over from one additional year, year 2. So we have year 1 here, where this is at the beginning of the set aside portion and what was spent. In year 2, we have to carry it over for 12 months, right here. If the school division does not expend the entire PSA share of Part B funds by the end of the carryover period, that would be this $1,000. In year 2, they spent $1,000. The remaining is $531.25. And this moves over into the final 3 months. The school division may use the remaining funds to pay for other allowable Part B expenditures for the public schools. So this remaining money in July, August, and September can be used for public school materials that are allowable expenditures. So you must have this money set aside, extend it for 1 more year, spend it down the last 3 months. The remaining money not spent on private schools can be used for public school expenditures that are allowed. So now that we reviewed the timeline for spending the PSA funds, let's walk through how the PSA is calculated. This is where the efforts of the child find and the count of children eligible to receive special education and related services is used. The number of eligible students with disabilities in the public schools is added to the number of eligible students with disabilities in the private school to give the total number of eligible students. 320 makes it 320, which is the total number of eligible students. The total of these two figures is used to determine the individual student portion of the set-aside funds. The division's total allocation for Part B 611 and 619 funds is $152,500. The total allocation divided by eligible students, private and public, which comes to approximately $476.56 per student, multiplied by the number of parentally placed children with disabilities, 20, gives you the PSA amount that must be set aside for parentally placed children with disabilities, the $9,531.25. The total allocation of $9,531.25 is subtracted from the total allocation, which lowers the funds to the public school division that are available for public school expenditures. The school division must maintain a separate accounting of the PSA funds expenditures and ensure documentation is retained for audit and monitoring purposes of these expenditures for the proportionate set aside. Let's move on to section 4, those things that are non-allowed and those that are allowed expenditures. Basically, we're just talking about what to do and not to do with the PSA fund. And see some of the questions that come up. Can the school division give the proportionate share of funds to the private school to provide equitable services? The answer is no. The control of funds used to provide special education services and the control of materials, equipment, and property purchased with these funds is the sole responsibility of the public school division. You must have accountability of these dollars. The school division may not use these funds to finance the existing level of instruction in a private school or to otherwise benefit the private school in whole. The LEA use of these funds can only be used to meet the special education and related services needs of parentally placed private school children with disabilities. Again, it cannot be used for meeting the needs of a private school or the general needs of the students enrolled in the private school. Supplement, not supplant. State and local funds may supplement and in no case supplant the proportionate amount of federal funds required to be expended for parentally placed private school children with disabilities. In other words, the PSA set-aside calculated amount of the school division's total IDA allocation must be spent first, and if there are additional costs for private school-placed eligible students, then local and state dollars can be used. But public schools are not required to spend additional dollars for additional local or state dollars for private placed students that are parentally. When identified, these children may be provided various screenings, such as hearing, vision or scoliosis, speech, voice, language, fine, and gross motor functions and screenings for instructional purposes to determine if a referral for an evaluation for special education and related services is indicated. This is called the child fine. However, the cost of carrying out the child fine requirements, including student screenings or evaluation costs, may not be considered in determining if the school division has met its financial set-aside obligation under the PSA regulation 34 CFR 300.133. In other words, the child fine process may not be funded with PSA funds. As you can see, it includes any screening expenses, evaluation expenses, staff and salary benefits, or supplies and materials for anything that has to do with child fine. Non-allowable use of PSA funds continue. The school division, as stated earlier, may not use the PSA set-aside amount to carry out the child fine requirements, including costs for administration, personnel, and screening or evaluation. It also cannot be used to create separate classes. A school division may not use funds available under Section 611 or 619 of this Act for classes that are organized separately on the basis of school enrollment or religion if of the children, if the classes are at the same site and the classes include children enrolled in public school and children enrolled in private schools. So you cannot have a separate class just for the children that you're going to serve in with proportionate set aside funds. Funds must not benefit a private school. This includes the repairs of private school facilities, minor remodeling of private school facilities, and construction of any private school facilities. Only allowable expenditures are included in service plans for eligible students. Every parentally placed private school child with a disability who has been designated to receive services must have a service plan. The plan must describe specific special education services that the school division will provide and where the services will be provided. The service plan is not the same as an individual education plan or an IEP that eligible students attending a public school are entitled to receive. The school division, however, to the extent appropriate, must develop, review, and revise service plans consistent with a timeline similar to an IEP process used in public schools. The service development plan and monitoring process includes, but is not limited to, inviting private school representatives and parents to the meetings to develop, monitor, and change service plans. This includes participation of parents who reside in another state and the child attends a non-public school in the school division's jurisdiction. However, IDA does not require that a parent provide written consent to a service plan. Parents may refuse services proposed in the service plan. However, the school division must continue to count the child as a private placed student eligible, but not receiving services. In other words, parent in the private school can refuse the services, but the school division must continue to count the child as a child in need of services in a parentally placed private school. A service plan should reflect only the allowable services the school division will provide to a parentally placed private school child with a disability who is eligible to receive services. In other words, that service plan focuses directly on that child as it would in an IEP. It's child driven. Allowable costs for services of indirect and direct. In the following slide, we will review allowable expenses for direct and indirect services. However, it is important to note again that these federal funds are never given directly to private schools. For all direct and indirect services, the school division must remain in control, track the expenditures from the PSA amount, and select the PSA tab in the Omega when requesting reimbursement from the DOE for these funds. The provision of equitable services must be only for those students found eligible in the private school. The services identified in the service plan may be provided by employees of a public school division or through an individual, association, agency, organization, or other entity contracted by the public school division. However, parentally placed private school children with disabilities may receive a different amount of services than children with disabilities in public schools. School divisions may use IDA federal funds to facilitate a private school student's access to services in a number of ways. School divisions may provide services on site at the private school, at a public or neutral site convenient to the private school, or provide services on public school grounds, and may contract for the provision of services at an appropriate site, ensuring that transportation is provided for the student. Often, private schools will welcome the opportunity to facilitate students' access to services at their site. Use of personnel. The school division may use funds available to make public school personnel available to provide services for parentally placed private school children with disabilities if those services are not normally provided by the private school. A school division may pay for the services of an employee of a private school to provide services if the employee performs the service outside of his or her regular hours of duty, and the employee performs the services under the public school division's supervision and control. Indirect services, allowable use of PSA funds. Let's talk about equipment and materials. The school division must control and administer the PSA funds to provide special education and related services. This includes the oversight of all materials, equipment, and property purchased with those funds, including, but not limited to, ownership of and rights to such materials, equipment, and property. Equipment and supplies may be placed in a private school for a period of time only to service eligible individual students and only if the equipment and supplies can be removed without remodeling the private school facility. The school division must remove such equipment and supplies when no longer serving those students or if the equipment and supplies are being used in an unauthorized manner. School divisions may not use funds for any repairs, minor remodeling, or construction of private school facilities. If equipment and/or materials are needed for accommodation, then the school division may purchase the items for use by the private school. However, the items remain the property of the school division, and when the equipment is no longer needed, then it should be returned to the school division. A record of the equipment purchased and loaned to the private school must be maintained by the school division and acknowledged in a signed document by the private school. This is important to keep for auditing and monitoring purposes. Training. The school division may arrange and provide trainings to the private school teachers and/or personnel, and they may be invited to attend school division trainings. The location of services and transportation. Service delivery, including on-site services, may be provided on the premises of private schools, including religious, elementary, and secondary schools to the extent consistent with state and federal laws. This may be less costly in terms of transportation and may be more appropriate for some children. Providing on-site services could help eliminate the need to transport children to and from services. Services may also be provided in an alternative location in a manner deemed appropriate by the school division. If it is necessary for a parentally placed child to benefit from or participate in the services provided under the service plan, he or she must be provided with transportation from the school or the home to a site other than the private school. and from the service site to the private school or to the child's home, depending on the timing of the services. The cost of this transportation may be included in calculating whether the LEA has met the expenditure requirements of the proportionate share. School divisions, however, are not required to provide transportation from the child's home to the private school. Section 5. We'll now discuss tips and rules for getting PSA reimbursements from BDOE. PSA funds must be tracked separately by the school division to ensure they meet the required allotted funding for PSA. Be sure to share this information with the appropriate finance office in your school division. Remember that the amount submitted in the annual plan is only an estimate. The actual amount the school division should set aside reserve is this PSA calculation. Do not spend more than the federal PSA set aside amount for parentally placed private school children. But as said earlier, additional local and state funds may be spent on parentally placed private school students. However, school divisions are not required to do so. These set-aside funds must be used for the purpose of PSA, with one exception. If all the funds have not been used during years 1 and 2 of the allocation, then the remainder may be used for public schools. When requesting reimbursement, use the drop-down button in Omega to identify proportionate set-aside related expenditures. Be sure to remember the carryover provision of 12 months. If after the 12 months there are funds left in the PSA that was not spent by the private school, then it should be used by the public school division. Do not leave funds on the table, please. Be sure not to close out funds without making sure the PSA funds are spent. Be mindful that there are 2 PSA allocations this year: regular IDA Part B 611 and 619, and ARP 611 and 619. We've concluded the content part of the presentation. These are some dates for you to remember. Please note the collection window opens October 22nd, 2021, and it closes on November 30th, 2021. We want to thank you for watching this recorded PSA session. Be sure to have your questions ready for the Q&A Zoom session on November 16th, 2021 at 2:00 p.m. A superintendent's memo. In the superintendent's memo, you should have gotten the link. If you did not, please contact us. These are some regulations and resources for your review and to download and look at if you need additional information. And for additional information, please contact the Office of Special Education Finance and Budget at sped-finance@doe.virginia.gov or the Office of Special Education Data at speddata@doe.virginia.gov. We thank you for watching the presentation and hope that it was helpful.